New federal jobs numbers, including revisions going back more than a year, show the economy in a weaker position than expected as the Trump administration demands Federal Reserve rate cuts, detains Korean workers in a raid on a Georgia electric vehicle battery plant, and unveils rules for its new policy of tax-free tips.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues on the editorial page, columnists Alicia Finley and Joe Sternberg. The data on Friday from the Bureau of Labor Statistics was jobs numbers for August. Employers added a net 22,000 jobs, with revisions also downward for previous months. Then on Tuesday, the BLS reported a downward revision for the period between April 2024 and March 2025 of 911,000 jobs lower than previously estimated. Let's listen to the White House responding to those figures in a press briefing on Tuesday. This is Press Secretary Carolyn Leavitt.
This was one of the biggest revisions in absolute terms in decades. And the benchmark year, March 2024 to 2025, shows that the job growth was vastly weaker during the Biden administration than ever previously reported. Between this revision and last year's, job growth was actually overstated by approximately 2 million jobs. And the Biden administration stood up here and vouched for that data and told you that data was real. And when President Trump calls into question the veracity of that data, like he did before he took the oath of office and even now as president of the United States, he was ridiculed for that. And turns out this revision proves two things. Number one, the president was right. And this is why we need new leadership at the Fed. And this makes it very clear that President Trump inherited a much worse economy by the Biden administration than ever reported. And it also proves that the Federal Reserve is holding our monetary policy far too restrictive. Interest rates are too high. The Fed needs to cut the rates because of the mess that we inherited from the Biden administration.
Alicia, what do you make of these jobs numbers and the weakness in hiring that they are showing in the U.S. economy?
Right. So as she pointed out, most of this period goes back to the Biden administration, and we were already seeing a slowdown in job growth. It was initially estimated at about 150,000 jobs per month during that period. They in this latest annual benchmark, which they do every year, in which they adjust the survey responses or data and all their models for the actual more comprehensive administrative records that they get from state unemployment insurance tax records. They saw a downward revision of about 911,000 for that year, which is about 75,000, 76,000 for every month. Now, we don't know exactly the monthly figures, how much they're going to be revised down for every month. We will see that actually this upcoming February. So it's possible that there were many fewer jobs earlier in that period, and perhaps as we saw, at least based on the initial survey estimate, there was a revival of job growth right after Trump won the election. But it does show that Trump inherited a weaker economy than we thought. But I think it also raises questions about the BLS data, reliability of the BLS data and its models. And it's possible that the current BLS reports, the employer survey, may actually be overstating the job growth. To your point, we've averaged about 27,000 every single month for the last 4 months. Well, that's actually well within the margin of error on this survey, which is about 137,000 for each month. So we could actually be losing jobs and not know it.
To that point, Joe, Trump has accused the Bureau of Labor Statistics of rigging these numbers. He fired the former BLS head and has nominated a new replacement, an economist from the Heritage Foundation, who may or may not get Senate confirmation. I'm skeptical of that narrative. I mean, I think there are pretty benign explanations for the difficulty that the BLS is having in getting this accurate data. So one of them is the lowering of the survey response rate. One of these surveys, now only about 43% of employers are responding to it, down from 60% before the pandemic. And as Alicia explains, if there are differences in the companies that respond and that don't respond. If large employers, for example, are more apt to respond to the survey, and their hiring differs from small employers, that is one source of this kind of measurement error in the data. And there is something amusing about the Trump line now that this BLS data is rigged, but it totally proves that my political opponent, Joe Biden, did a terrible job in office. There is something amusing about that contradiction, but it does shed some light on, I think, what was happening in the later Biden years. Remember, Team Biden and the White House was very frustrated by what they perceived as voters not grasping how good the economy was, how good they actually had it, and trying to explain to voters that actually the U.S. economy is pretty strong in the face of economic discontent. And part of the answer now seems to be that the economy was actually weaker than the White House and the official data were suggesting at the time.
Look, I mean, 2 points about all of this, which I think kind of crystallize some points that you both have touched on already. So, I mean, in terms of the accuracy of the data or any suggestion that there is some kind of political rigging going on here, it's important to remember that it is very possible for data like these to be what you could say ideologically rigged without being politically rigged. And by that, I mean, as Alicia pointed out, a lot of these numbers are very model dependent. You have to sit down as an economist working at the BLS with a particular worldview or an understanding based on your studies and sort of the dominant economic theories that are circulating in academia at the moment about how the economy works. And you use that worldview to help you develop the economic models that allow you to interpret all of this wonky survey data that is coming in, where you know that you're not accurately collecting data from different company sizes and from different regions. And so you can have a degree of ideological bias which creeps into the way that you think about those models and understand the way you think the economy works that can definitely create errors. But that is not the same thing as saying that there is a political bias where people in the BLS are sitting down every day when they come into work thinking, okay, how can we juke these numbers so that we help Democrats politically and hurt Trump? I don't think that is going on. So, I think there is an element here of a serious point about needing to think about what is that worldview that these economists are bringing to this exercise. Is it accurately reflecting what's happening in the economy? But on that score, I mean, there's also this question about these numbers of who cares. I mean, we've discussed this before on this podcast in the context of the BLS. I mean, sort of the funny thing about this is the notion from both Trump and the Biden administration before that voters were actually paying attention to the jobs data because voters know whether or not they have a job. These data are not effective at concealing or, from you if you have lost your job, and you're not going to feel better about the economy if you have, just because some BLS data, that you're reading about a month later are suggesting that someone somewhere else found a job. So, I mean, politically, what's been going on all along here is the reality that voters know what is happening in the economy. They know what's going on with their jobs. They know what they are experiencing when they sit around the kitchen table doing a household budget every week. They know what they're seeing when they go to the grocery store. And so what I find kind of funny is this exaggeration on all sides of the significance of these economic data. I mean, they are useful to policymakers. They're probably more important to the Federal Reserve than they should be, because I personally don't think the Fed should be trying to fine tune the labor market to begin with. But I mean, let's be realistic about what the political impact, or more likely the non-political impact of these numbers are when real Americans actually go to cast real ballots in a real election.
Speaking of those household budgets, the U.S. Census Bureau also on Tuesday released information on household income for 2024. Alicia, what does that report say, and what does it add to this picture about how the economy actually is being lived on the ground by Americans in the latter part of the Biden administration?
Right. So what the Census Bureau does, it produces an annual reports on poverty and household incomes in America. Now, these also rely on surveys. So in some ways, you can take them for a grain of salt. But as Joe pointed out, they also do have various models to correct for sample bias and such. Now, the survey for this 2024 found that real median incomes, household incomes actually grew by a pretty meager 1,040. And I say it's meager, I mean, that $1,040 isn't nothing. But given the sample, it wasn't statistically significant. So it could have been due to mere chance, is the way the census or statisticians would put it. But it's even worse because when you break down some of the demographic groups, well, you saw that the real median incomes actually fell by a statistically significant $2,060 for Blacks. And when you look at the income deciles, you saw almost all the gains go to the top 10 to 20%. For instance, the real incomes among the top 5% increased by about 11,500 on average, while you saw basically no gains in the bottom 50%. And notably, this doesn't even account, the census survey doesn't account for capital gains, which make up a large share of the top earners' income and also grew sizably last year as the stock market, especially after Trump's election, roared back. So what you really saw was ironically, growing income inequality during Biden's presidency, and especially during his last year.
Joe, how do you think all this informs the decision that the Fed now has as it considers whether to cut rates? I mean, President Trump and his advisors are talking about what they want is a mega rate cut, and I don't think that is in the cards. But to the extent that this suggests continued weakening in hiring and maybe the broader U.S. economy, where does that leave the Fed as it gathers for its next meeting?
I don't know if the Fed is in any more or any less of a jam than they were before these data revisions came out. I mean, the basic contour of the situation is that I think that Fed Chairman Jerome Powell would dearly love to cut interest rates. And he and other Fed officials have been signaling for a while that they were concerned that the economy might be softening, that there might be some various risks for economic growth that would make it difficult for the Fed to achieve the half of its mandate from Congress that has to do with full employment. I think that what has been causing some hesitation at the Fed probably was that they did not want to appear to be bowing to President Trump's demands for low rates or for rate cuts too easily. So there's been an element of optics here. But if the Fed really wanted to cut rates, which I suspect they do really want to do, this kind of data is going to give them a ready justification for doing it, which has the convenient virtue of not being related to anything that President Trump has said or done. These data sort of exist independently of whatever Trump is doing in the Oval Office. So that'll be a help. Now, do these numbers suggest that the Fed should cut rates? I'm skeptical about that. To the extent that we have a jobs problem or an economic growth problem in general, I did not think during the Biden administration that this was because interest rates were too high. I thought it was because the Biden administration was pursuing a lot of other economic policies, especially on energy, that were very hostile to the business investment that you need for economic growth. I don't think that rates are too high now, but I think instead our problem is the tariffs, first and foremost, which are probably denting business investment. But I'm not on the Federal Open Market Committee, so they're not going to ask me. And I think that they are going to look around the table thinking, how can we justify a rate cut? And now they've got one of those justifications if they want it.
Alicia, what's your read of that question? And digging in a little further on this point, the Journal's editorial today cites frothy financial market conditions as a reason to think that maybe this weakness in the economy is, as Joe suggests, not related to tight financial conditions, but it is related to other things happening, other drags on economic growth. I mean, the huge tariffs would be an obvious big one. Maybe another would be some of President Trump's deportation agenda. Notably, on Thursday last week, there was a ICE operation, an Immigration Custom Enforcement raid on a construction project building a electric vehicle battery plant in Georgia. This is a joint project of Hyundai and LG Energy Solution. Both of those companies are saying that they comply with the law. I'm not sure of the details of who exactly was picked up, if they were working for designated contractors on that job. Reports saying that many of those people who were detained are South Korean nationals. And it is an interesting question, Alicia, because President Trump promised on the campaign trail that he would focus on deporting criminal migrants, people who are here and are breaking the law. At the same time as he did this raid as the ICE operation did this raid on this battery construction site, he's trying to lure those kinds of projects. He wants big foreign companies to invest in the United States. And he says those kinds of things, electric vehicles, batteries, and whatnot, should not be built outside the U.S. and imported. They should be built here. Those companies should be trying to build those kinds of projects in the United States in places like Georgia. So it is then a little bit of a contradiction, maybe, to see this kind of raid. Maybe we'll have to wait for more details on who exactly was picked up, but some reports in the Korean press, economic press, for example, about frustrations these companies have had where they are putting huge investments in the United States and then trying to get their managers and their supervisors and their engineers who know how to make their products in the United States to make sure the construction gets done the way they want it.
Right, and not just construction, you have to train the workers, and that was actually an issue at a TSMC plant in Arizona that got a lot of attention because they were bringing in Taiwanese engineers to train American workers, and there's at least some complaints at the time that, and this was going back a couple of years ago, they're just bringing in Taiwanese workers to run these plants because there aren't enough American workers. No, that wasn't true. They just needed to actually be trained. Now, is a broader problem that a lot of employers report that they cannot find enough skilled workers, American workers, who will pass a drug test. This is a particular problem, actually, in the construction industry. And if you go through the Federal Reserve's beige book, which it's a periodic business survey, most businesses are citing, to Joe's point, issues with tariffs holding back hiring and investment, and in some cases causing consumers to pull back. But in the construction industry in particular, they're saying that they're having problems finding workers because of the slowdown in immigration, but also because of deportations and some workers being feared that they could get caught up in raids. And you saw that in the BLS latest monthly survey, where construction actually shed jobs, and you've had basically flat growth in construction jobs basically during the Trump's 7 or 8 months in office, while it had been growing pretty steadily last year. And again, in construction, there's a lot of demand, just not for home building, but also data centers, power plants, and such. This is actually one place where there is a lot of investment. And to your first question about, that's one reason why an interest rate cut isn't going to necessarily solve the problems in the economy. One of them is tariffs. The other is, in some cases, the lack of labor is restraining investment. Now, my worry, or when I look across the landscape, financial market landscape, is I do think that the conditions are frothy. And when you look at the equity prices, they're stretched to .com bubble levels, particular for these some tech companies. And that's driven in part by margin investing, basically investors borrowing, give a rate 5 or 6%, and then buying stocks and essentially arbitraging that and then selling for a big gain. junk bonds. There's been actually a surge in junk bond issuance, trying to take advantage of the current atmosphere with investors chasing yield. In fact, interestingly enough, I stumbled upon a little story about Cleveland Cliffs, our favorite protectionist steelmaker, that just issued debt to refinance previous debt. That was actually at a higher rate. Now, what that signals to me is that many companies actually find the current rate atmosphere very advantageous, and they may actually think that the rates may increase, at least market rates will increase, especially for more risky companies. And maybe they're thinking that there could be an economic slowdown. Who knows? But I do think that there's concerns that another rate cut will mainly help Wall Street and won't really help Main Street.
That, I think, is the challenge for the Trump administration, Joe, because if the analysis that we are getting from these revisions is that the economy in 2024 was not that great, most people didn't feel like their real incomes were going up, and that is a big part of why voters rejected another term of President Biden and put President Trump back in office, that it would be incumbent on the White House to stay focused on that mission. And instead, I think one of the temptations of being in office is to get distracted by all sorts of other promises that were made on the campaign trail, other policy agenda items. The deportations might be one, mass deportation, even of people who are here, trying to build battery plants to give Georgia workers jobs. Another would be maybe some of the tax promises that were made. The One Big Beautiful Bill, for example, enacted President Trump's no tax on tips policy. And notably recently, the Treasury Department released its list of occupations that customarily and regularly received tips on or before December 31, 2024, which is a limitation that is on this policy. And it includes some of the people you might expect, bartenders, wait staff, and whatnot, but also tailors, nannies, tutors, pet caretakers, event planners, locksmiths, digital content creators, bakers, home heating and air conditioning mechanics and installers. And Joe, my worry again is I know President Trump promised this on the campaign trail, but I worry that they are opening up what is going to be an enormous loophole, an effort to shift money from one tranche of income to another tranche of income. You can imagine a air conditioning repairman coming and saying, here's the price, unless you can pay me in cash. And part of that is a very generous tip, in which case it's a little bit of lower price. Just not productive activity. I get that there's a profit incentive to do that. But Joe, that is not going to be what is going to be adding to economic growth and making incomes go up.
Yeah. I mean, just on the tips issue and some of the scenarios you were sketching out there, Kyle, I want to point out, so for listeners who aren't aware, I'm based in London in the United Kingdom, and that kind of arrangement is actually very common over here already because people are trying to get around the consumption tax. And so you'll often pay your carpenter, your plumber, your roofer, that sort of thing in cash. And then get a little bit of a discount because they aren't declaring everything for the tax. So, I mean, you can end up with a sort of a similar situation, but kind of in reverse, where they are declaring that income, but they're calling it a tip instead of regular taxable income. And the result is the same. I mean, it just creates all of this chaos. The government doesn't really get any of the revenue or the economic activity that they were hoping for out of it. I mean, I think the bigger picture here with the Trump administration is it's like any administration. Fundamentally, some of its economic ideas are good. Some of them are abjectly terrible. And a lot of them are kind of somewhere in the middle. I think that the problem that we're going to run into is that, Trump's perverse genius as a politician is his ability to turn on a dime when he thinks it's convenient with a lot of things. So, I mean, some of these policies you can imagine over time a way that he might start extracting himself from even some of the immigration raids if it turns out that it's ultimately very counterproductive. I think the big problem is that one of the most counterproductive policies right now is the tariffs. And that seems to be the one thing that he really truly believes in and is least likely to try to pivot away from. So I foresee that being the big tension in the economy. And sorry to say for President Trump, it has nothing to do with interest rates or the Federal Reserve.
Thank you, Joe and Alicia. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.